Assalamu alaikum. Today we are going to look at Sir Philip Sidney in relation to the growth of English criticism in Britain, especially literary criticism in Britain. Earlier we saw Plato and Aristotle, who were Grecian and who lived quite some thousand years before Sir Sidney, and or even 2000 years, yeah, it would be 2000. So Sydney came sometime around 16th century, whereas the works, the criticism written by Plato and Aristotle belong to the 5th century BC. Okay, so there has been a gap of over 2000 years, right? So they laid down some ground rules which were worked upon by plenty of other writers like Horace, Quintilian, Dante, Longinus. All these were Roman writers, but when we come to England per se, there was basically a sporadic writing here and there in terms of criticism, but mostly they were working on literature. And criticism developed mainly because of a certain kinds of attacks that were made upon the writers themselves, as in verbal attacks. We're not talking about physical attacks, the verbal attacks. So, in one case, there were people or writers themselves who were trying to uphold or hold on to the classic examples and didn't require, didn't encourage any kind of innovation. Whereas, there was another kind of attack where from the Puritans, where the poets and the writers were held as evil mongers. Okay, as in there was this one Puritan called Stephen Gosson, that we'll talk about him later. But considering it all, we could say that Sir Philip Sidney made a benchmark writing when he brought about his criticism. His criticism was born out of necessity, so it is far more powerful than anything you could write just for the sake of pleasure. Okay. So we'll have a brief introduction of the writer and his work. He was born somewhere around 1554 and lived until 1586. Only some 6 years before his death, he concerned himself with criticism at all. He was basically an Elizabethan courtier. He was a courtier of the Elizabeth's court. He was and was had made a name for himself there. He was also a poet. He wrote both romantic and spiritual poetry, and he was a scholar interested in learning quite a bit. And he was also a soldier who made a name for himself in the battlefield as well. So he wrote quite a bit, but his most important works were Astrophel and Stella, an apology for poetry, or a defense of poesy as it is otherwise called, Arcadia, the Sidney Psalms. Sidney Psalms is just translations of Psalms by Sidney, which was not finished by Sidney himself, but was later on finished by his sister. Well, we'll go directly to the core of the matter. There was this one Puritan, who was a dramatist at some point himself, okay? We need to remember that. So Stephen Gosson was a Puritan who wrote a treatise declaring all poets as evildoers, okay? And he dedicated this treatise called School of Abuse to Sidney. Okay, whenever you offer a dedication, you have to take permission from them, right? He did not take any permission from him. Without any permission, he dedicated his book to Sidney. Now, this book centered upon, 4 counts. Okay, the attack over poets and poetry centered upon 4 counts. First, that man could employ his time more usefully than in poetry. So Stephen Gosson, he believed that people are wasting their time over poetry. I mean, that's a common perception, right? It's a common belief. Why do you have to waste time over poetry? What is there in it? Okay, you can do so many more important, useful things. Okay, so that was the first complaint. The second complaint was that poetry is the mother of all lies. The second attack, okay, more of a attack than a complaint. He believed that poetry is the mother of lies. Poets spewed lies. Again, a major, a very popular opinion, you could call it. Because what you find in poetry is lies, all lies, right? Well, mm, if you look at all the metaphors and similes used, well, you would be astounded. And if you started taking it literally, you too would call it all lies. It is a nurse of abuse. It is a nurse of abuse, as in it harbors abuse. It helps harbor abuse. And Plato had rightly banished poets from his ideal commonwealth. We spoke about how Plato insisted that in his ideal commonwealth as in an utopian state, okay, an ideal state, he won't allow any poets to be there, right? So Stephen Gosson says even Plato, the great philosopher, did not want any poets in his ideal commonwealth. To this, Sidney vehemently defended himself because, see, when someone accuses you of something, well, without any provocation, you are bound to defend yourself. So Sidney defended himself quite vehemently, and in the process, he used the critical authorities of the ancient classics and Italian writers of Renaissance, because see, there was not any critical authority in England. I mean, there was not any critical writing, you know, in England itself. So what does he do? He goes to the ancient classics and the Italian writers. Classics as in Greek and Roman writers and the Italians. So of the Greeks, he used sources from Homer, Plato, Aristotle, and Plutarch. And of the Romans, from the Romans, he made reference to Cicero, Virgil, Horace, and Ovid's remarks on literature. And from Italians, he borrowed copiously from Monturnio, Scaliger, and Castelvetro. The argument of his book. The main argument of his book it is a reply to Gossens. It was, the book itself, the Apology for Poetry itself, is a reply to Gosson, though he does not address Gosson by his name. Okay, he doesn't want to degrade himself. Probably he is maintaining his dignity by not directly, addressing Gosson. So the method he employs is quite logical. He acts like a logician and examines the whole and in parts, points in favor and in against. He examines, what does he examine? He examines poetry. Okay, the whole genre of poetry and literature. He examines it in whole and in parts, and he points out the things that are in favor of it and those that are against it. Now, see, and he says that the oldest branch of learning is poetry. Okay, so see, all the scriptures, when you look at no matter which religion you belong to, all religious texts are written in a poetic form, right? So he says it is the oldest branch of learning, whose milk by little and little enable them to feed afterwards of tougher knowledges. So you see, he says poetry is something that nourished and helped flourish the civilization itself, so that it could become stronger later on to take up tougher jobs. Okay, so it is like, the infant is given milk initially so that everything is easier for him to digest. As he grows on, more tougher food, more complex food is given. And by then, the grown child is capable of digesting it all and become healthy, become strong for tough work, yeah, for hard work. So you see, it is like this. It is like poetry is something that nourishes you in the beginning. What is the first form of learning language? How do you learn language first? We are taught ABC at school, right? And after teaching ABC, what does the teacher first do? Even before teaching ABC, what do you learn in preschool? Poetry, of course. So any language is learned first in poetic form because that is the easiest way of digesting it. At least Sidney believes that. So unless you know Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, how I wonder what you are, and that no one can forget that, right? So if you're learning some other language, of course, there'd be something Nila, Nila, Vodiva, Nila, Milvodiva. And come on, without those forms, I don't think we'd be interested in language at all. We wouldn't have learned, we wouldn't have gone on to reading prose or, fiction unless we had read poetry first. So it is like the milk, the first milk that is given to children. Okay, so it is the oldest branch of learning because it nourishes you from the beginning to make you tough for later, make you strong for later, harder jobs. Now, poetry is also superior to philosophy in terms of charm. Okay, it is superior to philosophy as in poetry itself philosophizes quite a bit. Well, there are poems that are not really that deep. They're just they just don't make any major impact in the way you think. But there are poems that reveal a greater truth. Okay, so they do philosophize, but then philosophy is not that beautiful as poetry is, right? Because poetry charms, whereas philosophy cannot. Philosophy can only give you truth, yeah, unadorned, unembellished truth, whereas poetry can charm and also give you truth. It is superior to history by its universality. It is superior to history in the sense when you read history, you are reading about one particular age, you're reading about one particular set of persons or kind of people or kind of life they had, right? But when you read poetry, it is about everyone, it is about all the people in all ages. So there is, the poetry itself is so much superior to history. And it is superior to science by its moral end. See, what is science necessary for? Science, yeah, helps in the growth or the modernization of the world, of the people. And it helps the people live a better life. To make life easy on earth, we need science, right? We understand the world around us through science. And it helps us live better. But then he says poetry is much more superior to science because it has a moral purpose. Poetry gives you moral purpose. You can live without science, you cannot live without morality. Well, science without morality, what would happen? Dr. Jekyll, remember Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? That's what would happen. Yeah? Science in wrong hands turns to curse. Okay? Okay. And it is superior to law by its encouragement of human rather than civic goodness. So it is superior to law in the sense the law tells you what is right, what is wrong, cut and right. Okay, whereas and then law tells you what is civic goodness. Civic goodness is in what is good for the society. It tells that, but poetry tells what is supposed to be human goodness. Okay. So the law could tell you that, okay, it is all right to take the pound of flesh from Shylock. In the end, initially it's Antonio who Shylock wants to take the pound of flesh from, but towards the end there is peripeteia, right? There is a reversal of fortune where Shylock becomes the criminal. Shylock is held as guilty, and Antonio is given free rein to take a pound of flesh from Shylock. The law would allow it. The law would even allow it, right? But that is civic goodness. What is moral goodness? What is human goodness? Letting him go, giving him a leaner fine, because you are human and you have to have some consideration for another human, even if he is a bad person. Some consideration. I'm not talking about letting him go scot-free. Some consideration. So poetry teaches human goodness rather than civic goodness. So the other arguments of his book. Well, he speaks of the various genres of poetry available during his time. There is in 16th century that were popular during his time, and he speaks of how each one is superior, how each one is quite, uh, you know, advantageous to mankind or were helpful to mankind. First of all, he speaks of pastoral poetry, which pleases by helpful comments on contemporary life and events in general. As in, what does pastoral poetry deal with? It speaks about the ordinary daily life and events, right? Rural life, especially about the generally we'll have a shepherd and a shepherdess, and a lot of greenery around. But basically, it deals with the very simpler concepts of life, simpler day-to-day interactions of life, and with those comments, you tend to go back to your roots. Again, elegy kindly gives you kindly pity for the weakness of mankind and the wretchedness of the world. What does elegy deal with? It makes you feel sorry for the weakness of mankind. Man is weak, but then elegy reminds you that man is weak and the world is wretched. And yes, it is better to sympathize with everyone than to be proud, to be vain about things that you have, because we are ultimately weak. Then satire, it helps by giving pleasant ridicule of folly. You know, what does satire do? It ridicules all that is ridiculous. There are people, there are things around us that are so ridiculous that we cannot even talk about them. We get so angry. But satire helps us, you know, not really encourage that kind of folly, but at least makes us feel pleasantly ridiculous about those follies. Okay. Then comedy, ridiculous imitation of the common errors of life. Comedy deals with the ridiculous imitation of the common errors of life. There is a little fine difference between comedy and satire, as you well know. Now, tragedy, it gives a moving demonstration of the uncertainty of this world. So, tragedy tells you that nothing in this world is permanent, and anything could happen at any moment, any time. So, yes, it brings home the grave truth of our own vulnerabilities. Lyric gives sweet praise of all that is praiseworthy. See, lyric is something that makes everything beautiful, especially those that are praiseworthy. Okay. Epic, once again, it represents the loftiest truth in loftiest manner. Because epic proportions, everything is in epic proportions. In the matter of length, in the matter of narrative, in the matter of characters, in the matter of a spectacle, epic is, it's far magnificent than drama or any other genres of writing. So it mainly deals with loftiest truths and left. Now you also have to consider that all these are advantages to men or people in general only when dealt in the right manner. Okay, so that one core understanding should be there. Another set of argument of his book is that addressing the four charges leveled by Gaussen. Gaussen levels some four charges, right? Addressing those four charges, he says, no learning is so good as that which teacheth and moveth to virtue. Okay? No learning is so good as that which teacheth and moveth to virtue, as in only when the learning teaches you some kind of virtue, moves you, affects a move in you to do some good, unless and until that learning does that for you, that learning is useless. Okay? If a study is not helping you become better, do better, then there is no point in learning it. So he says, none can teach us poetry. So no other learning can teach as well as poetry. All that is good. All that is virtuous. The question of veracity as in truthfulness or honesty. See, Gaussen also accused poetry of falsehood, right? So the question of veracity appears only when dealing with facts and the past or present. The poet only uses them to arrive at a higher truth. So see, the poet is not dealing with facts. He is dealing with incidents similar. He is just an imitator, right? Imitator of what is factual. Okay? He is not stating facts. So since the poet is clearly not stating facts, there is no point of arguing that he is speaking truth or lies, right? So the question of veracity does not even arise there. So that is another one of his arguments, Sidney's arguments. And he says it is not poetry that abuses men. Let's see, another one of Gosson's attack was that it is a nurse of abuse, right? He said poetry abused people, abused men, abused men's mind. But Sidney says it is not poetry that abuses men, it is man's wit that abuses poetry. Okay, well, in the sense that poetry does not abuse men. Poetry itself does not have any life, right? It does not have the propensity or the potential to abuse anyone. Okay, it is people, it is man's dirty mind that creates dirty poetry, bad poetry. It's a man with less profound thoughts, it's a man with less profound ideas that creates really, really bad poetry that is horrible. That is bad for people. Okay, so he lays the blame at people's feet. It's man's feet than on poetry itself. Now addressing the last attack, where Gosson said, see here, Plato had rightly banished poets from his ideal commonwealth. Yeah, here. Here, Sidney says, Plato will be a patron, not an adversary, as he did not banish poetry, but the poets who abused it and misrepresented religious beliefs of his time. Okay, it's supposed to be misrepresented, and there's supposed to be a comma here. Forgive me for the lapse. So, he says, of course, Plato said that he wouldn't allow any poets into his ideal commonwealth, but he was speaking of the kind of poets that lived during his time. And those poets abused poetry. They wrote the kind of poetry that were against the religious beliefs of his time. So, and corrupted the minds of people. So he did not want those kind of corrupt poets. Okay. So he wanted good poets. And Sidney says we have plenty of those. We have plenty of good poets and good poetry. So you need not worry about us. You need not worry about Plato not allowing us into his ideal commonwealth. Plato will be our patron there. You don't worry. Okay, it's a great response to the kind of attack that was laid on him. And yeah, this is all for today. We'll continue in the next class with with some of the finer points, finer details of his work. Thank you for now. Jazakallahu khair. Take care and stay safe. Assalamu alaikum.